And live from New York with us here on KLSU Baton Rouge is Mr. Marc Meyers. Marc, good to have you with us. How are you doing today?
Zia, we had to improvise a little.
That's something about live radio, and I never get tired of it. For after, 36 years, we always have some, technical difficulties and whatnot, and that's what is live radio is for.
You're still the voice with the most, man.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Marc Meyers, contributor to the Wall Street Journal, where he writes about jazz, rock, soul, rhythm and blues, as well as art and architecture. And in 2007, he started jazzwax.com, a top-ranked daily jazz blog specializing in jazz legend interviews and recordings. Good to have you with us.
Zia, great to be with you.
Oh, man, I'm all excited. And Mr. Dick LaPalma is listening to us this morning.
Dick is the best, isn't he?
Oh, I tell you.
What a pro.
Oh, not only that, he's like the older brother, he's always taking care of us.
Yeah, he really is.
Well, your book, Why Jazz Happened, and what a beautiful, as I mentioned to you, well-researched, and what a nice flow. I'm almost finished it. I got like maybe 20 pages to go, but enjoying every minute of it. Tell us about
it. Thank you so much.
Oh, you bet. And tell us how you came up with the ideas. You've been working on this for quite some time.
For me, Zia, most jazz books were so prohibitive. In other words, you had to know tons of recordings, you had to know tons of artists, and if you didn't know all the ins and outs of various things, it made it very hard for most people to access. And I wanted to write a jazz book that just told the jazz story at the height of jazz between 1942 and 1972, but to tell it in the most exciting, cinematic way that I could. And as a result, Why Jazz Happened just takes the average reader and also the expert reader through the non-jazz events, the unlikely events that had the most impact on the changing styles of jazz between those 30 years.
And also, I think something very special about your book, I read all sort of a history of jazz book. This is probably among the first, or maybe the first, that's talk about socioeconomics, political, and technological impact. And that's what I like about the theme of your book.
Oh, thanks a lot. Well, it's such a mouthful, as soon as people hear that, it's like, oh my God, what is, but, what people have to understand is that nothing happens in a vacuum. And jazz, as fascinating as it is, and it takes nothing away from the genius of the musicians and their innovations. Jazz styles change because external events change. Technology changes, culture changes, the civil rights movement changes, other types of music have an impact. So jazz's shifts and twists as it winds through that 30-year period, all those twists have a lot to do with these external pressures and opportunities.
Absolutely. And also, I think the most interesting, as you started your book, you're talking about the jazz at the time before, say, 1942, 1940. The music with the big band and Benny Goodman and all those great cats, it was more dancing music.
Exactly.
And then now we're talking about bebop era. Let's talk about some of that issue.
Yeah. Before 1942, jazz really is, primarily it's dance music for the most part, or it's folk music, meaning it's the blues, right? And then after 1942, magically, or, that was the reason I started this book, is like, well, why does that happen in 1942? What you see is individual expression. Individuals suddenly make their mark on jazz in a way that had been completely different than anything that had happened before, largely because these musicians were now free to express themselves as they wanted to.
Right. And then also let's talk about the recording companies, the Victors and Columbia Records and Decca and their monopoly. And some of them, they had their own radio stations, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, RCA and Columbia both had major networks throughout the country. I mean, the three record companies, Columbia, RCA, and Decca, basically had a stranglehold on the marketplace. And they basically, what you see there is they control the talent, they control what's on the radio, they're pretty much controlling everything. But all through this period, through the 1930s into the early 1940s, musicians are at war with technology. The jukebox, the radio, the phonograph, records, the talkie movies, all of these things are putting musicians out of work. And the Musicians Union by 1942 basically says, look, we're not working for the record companies anymore. You're putting too many of us out of work, and we don't want to work for you anymore. So for the next year, from 1942 to 1943, nothing's being recorded new in this country. All the musicians are on strike. Well, it's a ban actually, and they're not going into the studios. By 1943, Decca's on the ropes. They're virtually bankrupt. Decca says, "We'll sign whatever you want us to do. We'll sign." The musicians union says, "Great. You pay a certain fee on your sales into our union fund to help unemployed musicians, and you're good to go." What happens, Zia, is that hundreds of tiny little labels in New York and in Los Angeles and Chicago spring up and start to sign bebop musicians to record. And bebop is first recorded in 1944 in February because of this settlement. And then, of course, by the end of the year, RCA and Columbia throw in the towel, and they sign on as well. But bebop had been developed, as you know. By the early 1940s, it was already being developed, but it was never documented until this non-jazz event called the American Federation of Musicians Recording Band, which was then settled, which then recorded bebop for the first time in 44.
And then let's talk about the three giants, especially one of the guys that not only he was great musician, trumpeter, innovator, but he was an incredible businessman. Let's talk about Dizzy Gillespie.
Amazing, right? When bebop comes about in 1944, after it's recorded, for the next couple of years, it really is, it's despised by most other markets. Most other radio markets in the country won't have anything to do with bebop. They don't like it. It's basically a New York form at this point. But what happens during this period between 1944 and 1948 is you see the rise of the disc jockey, the rise of the concert promoter, and the rise of jazz media like Downbeat and Metronome.
Right.
And these guys all start promoting bebop as the greatest music ever, and the more they promote it and the stronger their signals get at the New York radio stations, this music starts to go over the mountains and into the South and into the Midwest. Other stations and other audiences start hearing it, and by 1948, Dizzy Gillespie he's not only one of the finest musicians around in 1948. He's also a fashion statement. Bebop becomes a fashionable, trendy thing, and it becomes a national sensation. So much so that Life magazine does a huge photo spread of Dizzy Gillespie.
Right, and with his beret and his fancy glasses and his goatee, and it was quite a fashion.
It was. And that's thanks to guys like you, people who preceded you on the radio, thanks to the jazz media, and thanks to guys like Norman Granz who promoted this music aggressively.
Well, let's talk about the radio personalities of those days. Let's talk about Symphony Sid and Leonard Feather and all those cats.
Yeah, I mean, what they did is they brought a new language that fit in. It was almost like it was almost the language equivalent of bebop. The kinds of things that they would say on the air, the hip quality. I remember Creed Taylor in my book, the famous producer Creed Taylor, living as a kid down in Virginia at the time, or almost an adult, and he said he remembered Symphony Sid's broadcast coming down, reaching him in Virginia at night, at midnight, and how intimate. Sid was at Birdland or the Roost or wherever he was.
Yeah.
But, he would say, "Hey, man, let's go visit with Dizzy and Count Basie," and he'd go over to the bar, and it was just this. It was this imaginary place that so many people wanted to come to New York to visit these clubs because the radio disc jockeys had created such an atmosphere, a nocturnal mystique for the music that everyone felt very cozy and familiar with these musicians, very intimate.
And I think exactly what you were saying. Creed Taylor, who started CTI, he was saying that, he was listening to the radio, and Symphony Sid is sitting in this club setting, and while he's playing the music, and there's a sort of a break during the intermission, he's talking about, here's Charlie Parker talking to this guy, here's Count Basie walked in, and things like that. I mean,
it's almost like journalism. It's like he's reporting on what's happening in the club, but of course it's creating an enormous appetite among jazz listeners and even non-jazz listeners who stumble onto these stations because they can't sleep. The other interesting thing is, of course, is that jazz radio like this was always going on after midnight. And it was going on after midnight, so, it could reach far out as other stations went off the air. It could reach all over the place. But what they did is they touched young kids. They touched the hearts of young kids who were listening to these incredible adventures going on in New York and couldn't wait to get up here to visit the clubs.
And I can imagine Symphony Sid doing all-night program. After everybody finished with their programs, he was up till 6 o'clock in the morning. That's incredible.
Yeah, I mean, jazz during this period, goes from being a sort of a ballroom dance kind of thing, and it takes on this nocturnal aura. It becomes the music of the night, right? You know, neon signs and and cars and windshield wipers and shiny, glossy curves of cars. I mean, it becomes a nighttime music, and the disc jockey has a lot to do with that.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about the arrival of 45 RPM records to replace 78, and how that's and also arrival of the 10-inch LP and all that. Let's talk about some of that.
Yeah, isn't that an amazing story? I mean,
incredible.
You know, from 1917 to 1948, you have basically you have the 78 RPM, which has about 3 minutes per side.
Right.
And except for, you know, for average people, that's great. You know, they listen to a Artie Shaw or something on there. But for the classical listener, they had to buy these things called albums that looked like photo albums that had maybe 8 of these things in there so they could listen to a whole symphony.
Right.
So by 1948, Columbia decides, you know what? You know, let's go after the home market. The home market's basically untapped. Most of our records that we produce are going for the jukebox and to radio, but you know, the home market's just there. But we can't market these 3-minute records to the home market. The person in the homes, thanks to the GI Bill, you know, there's millions of new homes in suburbia. These people all have phonographs. They want to relax in their living rooms. So Columbia develops this thing called the long playing record, a 33 1/3 record that runs for 22.5 minutes per side on the 12-inch and about 15 minutes on the 10-inch. And when it's released, I mean, it completely transforms the market. The market is completely changed. Everybody who now is living in a home wants the records for their phonograph, and the pop music field and the jazz field, they start on 10-inch records, not 12. The 12-inch record was originally for the classical listener because they had money. They could spend more on those larger records. The 10-inch was for pop and jazz. And why was it 10-inch? Because the companies had to pay royalties on each song. And Beethoven, if you did Beethoven's symphony, you didn't have to pay Beethoven's great-grandkids a royalty. It was all public domain classical music. But most of the recordings, the pop and jazz recordings, came off of Tin Pan Alley, Cole Porter, Irving Berlin. So all of those guys needed to be paid royalties. So 10-inch was just enough that the record companies could break even, but it wasn't until the mid-50s that you see the 12-inch for pop and jazz, because suddenly production costs have come down, and now they can afford those extra copyrights. And it changes rock. I mean, if it wasn't, of course, the 45, Zia. RCA, a year later after Columbia releases the 12-inch, the LP in 1948, in 1949, RCA says, we're going to do you one better. We're going to introduce the 45 RPM.
Right.
And they compete. That competes with the LP until all of the classical musicians on RCA say, you know, we're not going to record for this company anymore. We're going to Columbia. RCA drops the 45, they adapt the 12-inch LP, and the 45 starts to be used on the radio and the jukebox as the replacement for the 78.
Oh, it's incredible. And then, you know, along with that, describe that in early, the first recording in 1917 with the original Dixieland jazz band, that, you know, they were using one microphone, and then they have a number of microphones. And then let's talk about later on with Rudy Van Gilder and his magnetic tape. So tell us about the development that technology.
You know, magnetic tape was a German development during World War II, and it wasn't until after the war that GIs, people in the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, discovered these boxes with tape running, and they brought them back to the States. And one thing led to another, and, you know, tape recorders, they started to develop tape recorders. In fact, Bing Crosby and Louis Armstrong, I believe, received the first tape recorders from Ampex to sort of test it out. They could record their voice and play it back and listen to it while on the road. But what happens is without tape bringing down the costs of recording and making records, you're able to have the LP and the 10-inch LP and the 45. If not for the tape recorder, you wouldn't have had those. Before tape, to make a record was like Frankenstein's laboratory, Zia. You know, you had metal parts, and you had chemical baths and electrified solutions, and you know, you watch these videos of how records used to be made, and it was just like making a car in a factory or something. It was just insane. When tape is introduced, suddenly tape eliminates all of that, because you can record over it, you can splice it, you can do all kinds of things with tape, and it's extremely cost efficient. As a result, more and more musicians were asked to do recordings because now it wasn't so expensive to make a record.
Exactly. And then, later on with Rudy Van Gilder, where he had this studio at his parents' house. And what a piece of history is right there, that he changed the whole technology.
It's funny. Denny Malay, Gil Malay's wife, told me a very funny story.
And he's the one who introduced Rudy to the owner or the president of Blue Note, right?
Right. Gil Malay is really the first 10-inch LP that Rudy records in 1952. But, Alfred Lyon, who owned Blue Note, knew nothing about tape. He knew nothing about recording or anything back then. He knew music, and he knew how to get artists into the studio, and he knew how to make records the old-fashioned way. But Gil Malay went rushing over to Alfred Lyon and said to him, "You got to come hear this guy who's recording out in Jersey in his parents' house in Hackensack. He's doing something amazing." And Alfred, in his thick German accent, says, "Was is he doing? Was is he doing?" And Gil Malay says, "No, you got to come see it. He's doing everything on tape." And Alfred said, "This is very exciting. I've got to come out." He goes, "But what is tape?" So, even in 1952, Alfred Lyon, who becomes a giant in the jazz record field, on Blue Note Records, in the beginning knew nothing about this tape business.
Right.
Funny story, isn't it?
Incredible. And then let's talk about the West Coast jazz. And, at the beginning, they were very resistant to bebop, and then they accepted that. And then we heard all this relaxed style of the cool jazz from the West Coast.
Yeah, the West Coast sound, the Jerry Mulligan Quartet, the Dave Tell Octet, Lenny Niehaus Octet, the Les Brown Band out there. A lot of these, Shorty Rogers, there's a relaxed, yawning sound to that music. It's not so laid back that it's easy listening, but it's a more space-filled. There's more space in that music than in the East Coast. And through my research, I was saying, well, why does that happen there? Why is this music, this type of music, this sound developing in California, not in Dallas or Miami or someplace else? And the more I looked into the Los Angeles area during World War II and after World War II, the more you realize that the climate out there, the rise of the suburbs develop in Los Angeles. It's the largest suburbs developing in the United States, and it's developing faster than anywhere else in the United States. It's developing in circles around Los Angeles, big concentric circles that are running around Los Angeles, where you've got tract housing and strip malls and highways.
Mm-hmm.
It's just this lifestyle of laid-back golfing and the racetrack, an enormous opportunity for musicians, primarily because by the late 1940s and early 50s, you have the introduction of Technicolor for the movies. You have movie soundtracks. You see the rise of television in 1949, which needs music. All of the recording companies are now out there. So you see this mass industry rise up, and they need highly skilled musicians who can come in and record things very, very quickly and be on the money with what they're doing. So it becomes this magnet for musicians. And these musicians all go out there to do enormous amounts of work, but in their spare time, they're also recording jazz. And the jazz that they're recording has, to me, in my research, the sound of Los Angeles at this time, the ocean, the long sunsets, the golfing, a very laid-back atmosphere out there produces this very laid-back music, just as the compressed New York environment with its subways and hustle and bustle and crowds and tight spaces produces bebop. The West Coast produces a sound that's endemic to that environment.
Also, now the next step, let's talk about the R&B and the soul jazz. As a matter of fact, last night I went through my archive and I pulled out this Blue Note collection called Greatest Samples from the Blue Note Lab. And what they've done, basically all these hip-hop artists and, rappers, they took these originals from Lou Donaldson, from Ronnie Foster, Donald Byrd, Joe Williams, Grant Green, and they lay down the track to do their hip-hop music. So let's talk about that influence of R&B and soul jazz.
Well, by the early 50s, what you see is the East Coast is pretty much coasting. There's no real new music being developed on the East Coast in the very early 50s. They're not quite sure where to go. Opportunity hasn't been created yet on the East Coast. Bebop has pretty much flooded the market, and it's saturated, and everyone's sort of tired of it because there's so much of it by the early 50s. And at the same time, R&B has with magnetic tape and 45 RPMs, and the teen market with portable phonographs. R&B is taking away it's taking away the teen market with its simplicity and its power. And the jazz on the East Coast, Alfred Lion says to himself, unless we, in the new LP era, I got to fill more space on these 10-inch albums. I got to figure out some kind of music to put on here. And what Alfred Lion does is, he looks at the West Coast and sees that the front of the band is all horns. It's pianoless out there, and there's no real beat, but it's a big horn up front, trombone, tenor saxophone, and trumpet mostly. And he looks at that, and he sees that popularity. At the same time, on the East, he sees the rise of R&B with that big, solid beat and the blues. And what he ingeniously does is he brings that together. He looks for artists that can bring that together. And Lou Donaldson with Clifford Brown, they're able to bring together that horn-centric, big beat R&B sound. And the result is hard bop.
Yep.
And, with Clifford Brown and Max Roach and, all of these genius musicians then developed this type of music. But if it wasn't for, Bob Shadd at Emercy and Prestige, Bob Weinstock and Alfred Lion and Blue Note, creating an opportunity for egging these guys on and saying, yeah, give me recordings, more of this hard bop stuff. These musicians then develop ingenious music that, that style of music is around until about 1956. It continues to this day, but its heyday is really from 52 to 56 at Clifford Brown's death in the summer of 56.
Right. Also interesting, Mark. By the way, for our listeners, we're talking to Mr. Marc Meyers. He's got a brand new book called Why Jazz Happened. He's a contributor to the Wall Street Journal, live from New York. He's with us on the phone. The three sort of labels that, the guys that they came in, they mostly migrants from Europe. We're talking about the Chess Brothers from Poland. We're talking about Alfred Lion coming from Germany or Eastern Europe. And then Ahmed and his brother Nasuhi Ertegun, that they were Turkish, son of the diplomats. And isn't that incredible? I mean, myself, here's a Persian guy, comes to Baton Rouge, 40-some-odd years ago, and 36 years later, we were celebrating America's classical music jazz. Isn't that something?
It is fascinating. And, what I looked at in my book, going back to the 30s, why were so many ethnic groups so interested in jazz? The Italians as well, of course, Charlie Ventura and all the others. And it's interesting. So I can't remember who it was, and I don't know that it is even necessarily in the book. But, when I spoke to somebody about this and this influx and this interest and passion on the part of those who came here, what the person said was pretty interesting. He said, jazz, for the most part, when they were kids, their families listened to ethnic music.
Exactly.
First generation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the ethnic radio stations not only featured ethnic music, whether it's Persian music or it's Turkish music or Yiddish music, whatever it is, but those stations also were the first ones to start featuring jazz.
Exactly.
And at the same time, jazz really is folk music. It's not that different.
Mm-hmm.
When you listen to Persian music and you listen to, Turkish music, or you listen to, even Jewish music and Italian traditional music, jazz it's a cousin. You can hear it's not as much improvisation, but there's this passion and this folk spirit and this humanism in that music that I think is the common denominator. Don't you?
Oh, absolutely. And as a matter of fact, Mark, you just said it's right on the target. That when I was a little boy, and my dad he had the shortwave radio. He had one of those Grundig shortwave. And at night, we used to listen to Voice of America, first the news, and then the legendary Willis Conover.
Oh.
And because of Willis, I'm on the air, period.
Isn't that something?
And I worshiped, I worshiped the guy, everything he did, to the point, the nights that we were sitting and listening to Voice of America, here's Zia, 12 years old, with a piece of paper taking notes.
What did you like so much about Willis Conover's voice?
Oh, he was. Well, he was talking very slow because probably 20 million listeners that he had in Eastern Europe and Middle East and Far East, they couldn't speak English. So he had to speak very slow, and his voice was God-given. I mean, and interesting, I told this story to my listeners several times, and as a matter of fact, this afternoon I'm doing a spotlight on Mose Allison. One night, we were listening to Willis, and he came with his voice and said, "Tonight we're going to feature Mr. Mose Allison." And he started playing the music, and we were floored. I looked at my dad. I said, "Man, this guy is incredible." Not knowing that 30-some-odd years later, I sat next to Mose. We brought him to Baton Rouge. We gave him an honorary doctoral degree. He graduated from Louisiana State University. He graduated from English department here.
Right, right.
And we gave him, as a matter of fact, English department, the chancellor and the dean was so nice to invite me to sit next to him. And I called my brother in Tucson, Arizona. I told him that, and he thought I'm joking.
Wow, what a great story.
But that's what it was. The shortwave radio, as you said, and the Willis Conover and all those cats. And interesting enough, for our listeners out there listening, Voice of America, one of their subsidiary was basically Armed Force Radio in different countries. And there were disc jockeys, and then they were carrying these syndicated shows specifically made for those audience. So we had Wolfman Jack having a rock program for the audience in Tehran, Iran, when Shah of Iran was in power.
Wow.
I mean, imagine that. And the rest is history. Incredible. Then tell us about the fusion part of it, where the rock and jazz, they finally, they got together.
Yeah, by the late 60s, music has completely changed. You obviously have the youth culture rising. The youth consumer in the early 1960s is now buying pop rock and buying all kinds of interesting things at Motown in the early 60s and Stax. And then by 1964, the Beatles arrive, and the youth market pretty much now dominates the record industry in terms of sales. And by the late 60s, jazz is starting to realize that if they want to reach more than 1,000 people in a club or 1,000 people in 2,000 people in a theater, they're going to have to play either a lot louder, and they're playing about as loud as they can, or they're going to have to do what basically Bob Dylan did in 1965 at the Newport Folk Festival, is they're going to have to go electric.
Right.
Because that's the only way they're going to be able to, reach larger numbers of people. And jazz musicians, a lot of them at the time were young, and they liked rock. It wasn't what they played. It wasn't what they loved more than anything. They still loved jazz, but they realized that there was something about rock that was connecting with young people, and they had to figure out a way to take what they loved, jazz, and sort of push it through that filter so that more people would start to appreciate what they were doing. But it's not just electric. I mean, by the late 60s, rock is not only an electric form, but it's a volume form.
Exactly.
The kids in the audiences need to feel this music on their chest. They need to really feel the power of the music. And jazz realizes this, and you start to see the decline of the trumpeter. I mean, Miles Davis, of course, and Freddie Hubbard are dominant during this period, but the new instrument that comes up in jazz is the guitar, right? Larry Coryell and John McLaughlin and John Scofield, the guitarists, because you could suddenly see the person's face. I mean, the reason why the rock bands, the Beatles, the Stones, all these guys were so popular is because they all held their instruments down by their belt, and you could see their expressions on their face. You couldn't really see that on the faces of a saxophonist or a trumpeter because the instrument's in their mouth.
That's
so
right.
The electrified instrument, volume, the rise of the guitar, and Miles Davis. Let's not discount the influence of bands like Sly and the Family Stone.
Oh, very much so.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
yes, indeed.
Big impact. If the Beatles had an impact on a lot of white musicians, then Sly and the Family Stone had a huge influence on many black musicians.
Very much so.
And the synthesis of bringing all this together, you see with Tony Williams' Emergency in 1969, Lifetime. You see it with Miles Davis's Bitches Brew. You see it in 67 with Gary Burton's Duster. There's this fusion of the two forms. And then by 1971, Freddie Hubbard, of course, in 1970 with Red Clay. But by 71, it's jazz has gone electric with Weather Report.
Oh, yeah.
And by 73, of course, Return to Forever and all the other groups that emerge.
This is wonderful. Mark, I want to ask you a favor. God willing, and I'll be in touch with you. I would like to have you on the air with us at least once a month.
Oh, Zia, it would be my honor. I mean, you run the greatest show. Everybody knows you run the greatest show. I mean, you're the dean of dean of jazz disc jockeys. That's widely known. It'd be an honor for me if I could ever, if you would love to have me back and your audience digs it, then I'm happy to make that same.
Oh, absolutely. And I want to thank Dick LaPalme to put us in touch with you. I have a segment during my afternoon show on public radio that I refer to in search of golden nuggets, and you're one of the golden nuggets right there.
Oh, Zia, you're so kind. Dick LaPalma, of course, was Nat King Cole's record promoter. And,
very much so.
His closeness with Nat King Cole, Nat King Cole is such an important figure because he straddles pop and jazz so
very much
firmly.
So.
I don't think there's another artist that so connected those two together. And one could say that without Nat King Cole, there wouldn't have been a 50s Sinatra.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
There
wouldn't have been the Peggy Lee sound. Nat paved that whole way, and Dick was right by his side, helping him make it all happen.
Oh yeah, I mean the influence of the great Nat King Cole, as far as Ray Charles and all those pianists.
Yeah, absolutely.
They all worship him.
Class act. Class act. just. And that doesn't even get into how Nat changed the civil rights movement, how he
very
made
much so.
This is a guy, an African American who had a television show in the mid '50s. It's unheard of.
I got to tell you a quick story about Dick LaPalma.
Yeah.
About 15 years ago, my wife got me a book. It was probably one of the best books that I read about Muddy Waters, and is a female author. Anyway, so I read it twice, and there are about maybe 20 black and white pictures in the middle of the book. And I knew 80% of the blues guys in those pictures, but I never bothered to read the footnotes. So the third time I read it, I said, well, let me go back to the pictures and start reading every one of the footnotes on every picture. I got to the last picture. The Chess brothers are sitting in their office. Muddy Waters is there, and there's this young, good-looking guy with a skinny tie, and that's Dick LaPalma.
He pops up everywhere in great music. It really is quite something. He has such great taste and had such great instincts. I mean, that whole business back then, before all the technology we have today, before you could research people right away, it was all built on instinct and a handshake. And,
exactly.
Dick was the most. His reputation was sterling, and his gut was so incredible. I mean, that to be able to come through that era with his kind of reputation is really, it's all about who he was and what he could do and what he did, and that's all you were worth back then, because you didn't have all the spin stuff that you have today.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Mark, let me tell my listeners again. Mr. Marc Meyers is with us for the past 30 minutes. His brand new book just hit the market about a couple of weeks ago called Why Jazz Happened. And he's in New York, contributor to the Wall Street Journal. And also he has a wonderful blog called jazzwax.com and has a wonderful aura about his style and interviews and the recording reviews and things in that nature. And prior to this, you were with New York Times, right?
Yeah, I started when I was a kid and in college. I interned and started at the New York Times and did some writing for the New York Times as well. I started at the top, but it gave me a lot of confidence. That's
wonderful. Well, it was a pleasure to have you with us, and God willing, I'll be in touch with you to make this a regular gig once a month.
Yeah, it'd be an honor. It would be an honor, Zia, to be with you and KLSU. I mean, it's the greatest, it's the greatest station.
My pleasure, and you have a wonderful day. Happy jazzing, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks, Zia. Appreciate
Thank you.
it.
Bye-bye.